Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Mary Gallagher. I'm a faculty associate at the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. I'd like to welcome you to the 7th presentation in the noon lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center. For fall 2023, the complete series schedule is available here today and also on our website. We send out email reminders weekly. I have a few announcements. This Thursday, November 9th at 4 p.m., the LRCCS Author Series will present Curtis Chin, author and filmmaker who will talk about his new book, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. The event will take place in the 4th floor amphitheater of Rackham on East Washington, and a book signing will take place afterwards. The next presentation in the fall 2023 noon lecture series will take place on Tuesday, November 14th, and will be given by Ken Swope, professor of history and senior fellow of the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society at the University of Southern Mississippi. He will be speaking on trickle-down Confucianism, war reconstruction, and cultural assimilation in the late Qing. Today's presentation will be given by Dr. Jeffrey Javed. Dr. Javed is a former postdoc fellow at the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies and the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. He currently works in the tech industry, formerly senior staff researcher at Shopify and staff researcher at Meta, where he researches data privacy and the benefits and risks of AI-powered products. He received his PhD from the Department of Government at Harvard in 2017. Today, he will be speaking on righteous revolutionaries, morality, mobilization, and violence in the making of the Chinese state. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mary, for the kind introduction. I'd just like to begin by expressing my condolences to the community for the passing of Debing Su. Debing and I worked together when I was a postdoc here several years ago, and she was a really wonderful, cheerful, kind person, and I'm really sad to hear about her passing. She actually was quite instrumental in socializing this work when I was here, and so she also has a special relationship to this project that I'm going to talk about today. So this research is that I'm going to present today is more or less highlights from my book that recently came out last year through University of Michigan Press, entitled Righteous Revolutionaries, Morality, Mobilization, and Violence in the Making of the Chinese State. The central question of the book is to understand how the Chinese party state eliminated its internal rivals and extended its authority over society after 1949. Specifically, I look at the case of land reform in the early PRC period. Land reform in the early 50s was an extremely violent campaign. Millions of landlords were persecuted in the name of class struggle. It's estimated somewhere around 1 million landlords and other people who were labeled as landlords lost their lives during this period. This was explicitly a state-building effort to establish the primacy of the party state's authority through mass violence. However, the conditions for state-building during this time were actually quite poor. So a puzzle here is how exactly the Chinese party state mobilized violence and consolidated its authority during this time, considering that coercive power was unevenly distributed in the newly conquered territories. The party state was moving from the north into a vast amount of territory in the south that it had very little control over. It had very limited personnel to conduct land reform. And most importantly, it was mobilizing violence using a social cleavage, class conflict that historically had very little resonance in Chinese society. And this is something that many Chinese scholars and historians have written about at length. So how exactly was the Chinese party state able to mobilize so much violence and consolidate its authority and legitimacy in the early 50s? So the central argument of the book is that a state, and specifically here the Chinese party state, can build authority, which I define as an enduring capacity to mobilize the population's compliance with the state's demands by undercutting the moral standing of its internal rivals and portraying itself as the defender of the popular moral order. And I have a two-part argument that I explore in this book. First, that the party-state mass mobilized violence against local elites after the revolution by impugning their moral character, as opposed to using material incentives or appealing to the notion of class. Secondly, I argue that where the party-state mobilized more collective violence, it established stronger collective identities that facilitated compliance with other state goals, such as conscription in the Korean War, economic production, and repression in other campaigns of mass violence in the 1950s, such as the anti-racist campaign. So theoretically, I'm trained as a political scientist, the way in which this relates to theories of state building in that literature, the state building literature has typically looked at state building as a mostly coercive process, but I'm arguing that while obviously state building in the early PRC was very violent and coercive, it also had a, I think my screen here just, okay. Anyway, this is fine. It was also a highly cultural and symbolic process. So state building is both normative and coercive, involving not just physical violence against internal rivals, but also delegitimizing them. Secondly, I relate this case study to the moral psychology literature. There's been a lot of recent research on how moral emotions can shape in-group, out-group divisions and increase punitiveness, essentially the threshold the threshold at which people accept participating in or witnessing violence. I look specifically at the emotions of outrage and sympathy in creating in-group, out-group divisions. Methodologically, I explore this case study through a systematic process analysis of the Huaibei and Jiangnan regions. You can see the map of China in the early 50s up top. The area in the middle there in the box is the East China Bureau, at least the middle part of the East China Bureau. The CCP had split up the PRC into these large macro kind of clusters of provinces after 1949 that they eventually eliminated. But the East China Bureau encompassed Shandong, Anhui, Jiangsu, Fujian, and Zhejiang. And I look specifically at Anhui and Jiangsu and the regions of Huaibei and Jiangnan. So the provinces of Anhui and Jiangsu are bisected into these two regions. Huaibei historically is a very poor, kind of environmentally harsh region of northern Anhui and northern Jiangsu. Historically, it's had a lot of population turnover and turnover in land, a relatively equal distribution of land holdings, while Jiangnan has historically been one of the wealthiest regions of China and one that has had the highest levels of land holding inequality, especially on the eve of the Chinese Revolution. And so I picked these two regions to look at the contrast of land reform mobilization in a relatively poor, relatively equal land holding political economy and in a wealthier, more starkly unequal land holding economy. So I do a case study of each of these regions using a mix of archives, internal party materials, oral histories, as well as journals and memoirs. And then I look at the quantitative relationships between violence and other explanatory variables using a county gazetteer data set of 250 counties. And I look at these counties across not just Anhui and Jiangsu, but also Zhejiang and Fujian. If you look at the bottom picture here, the yellow, the yellow highlighted regions are the areas in which I collected archives or internal party materials. So when I refer to case study materials, to the qualitative materials, it's drawn from these specific regions. Obviously, access to historical data in China is very limited, and so I was constrained by where essentially I could get access to historical materials. So today I'll talk about three things that should be numbered 1, 2, 3. First, I'll talk about moral mobilization in Jiangnan. Then I'll review the cross-county analysis, the quantitative analysis, and then I'll talk a little bit about moral mobilization in China after Mao. So moral mobilization in Jiangnan. So this is speaking to the first of the two major arguments in the book, that the party state is mobilizing violence against local elites by impugning their moral character, not necessarily using traditional class appeals or material incentives. Central to this argument is this concept that I call moral mobilization. Moral mobilization is the state's leveraging of shared norms of right and wrong behavior to demarcate a virtuous in-group and a villainous out-group, eliciting sympathy for the former and outrage against the latter. This involves multiple steps. First, it involves what I call moral boundary work, which defines an outgroup and casts its members outside of society's span of sympathy by alleging them to be morally bankrupt, and builds solidarity in the in-group by cultivating sympathy for the plight of its fellow members. Second is what I call moral theatrics, which dramatizes specific alleged transgressive acts by this oppressor outgroup to provoke outrage from the in-group against members of this outgroup. This outrage diminishes sympathy for alleged transgressors and motivates support for or participation in violence against them. I find that this is a recursive process in which repeated engagement in violence crystallizes these in-group and out-group identities, which facilitates further mobilization. So I look at both Jiangnan and Huaibei as case studies in this book, but I'm going to specifically focus on Jiangnan today. I look at Jiangnan as a least likely case. Again, it is one of the wealthiest and most unequal parts of China, and it is a part of China that the party itself insisted was home to the most wily landlords. It has a strong history of rent resistance and landed elite, and so this is a most likely case for materialist mobilization using traditional class appeals, and least likely for a moral mobilization style of mobilization that uses non-class appeals that focuses more on moral transgression. However, when the party state was organizing violence in Jiangnan, they very quickly realized that class consciousness was in fact quite low. They struggled to make sense of local class relations, and internal reports show that peasants and landlords did not actually know each other. Political consciousness was low. Even in areas here, such as Jiading County, where landlords had 20 times more land than poor peasants, according to an oral history with a land reform cadre, the political awareness of people in the region was quite low. So the party state actually found that mobilizing violence in this historically wealthy, unequal region was actually quite difficult. So how did they do it? Again, I argue that they engaged in this process of moral mobilization, beginning with moral boundary work. They set out to demarcate an outgroup of quote-unquote evil tyrants and landlords by collecting extensive materials on their alleged wrongdoings. Archival evidence, here's just like a sample of some archival evidence, directives to collect information on the quote-unquote historical crimes of the landlord class. Local cadres claimed that they used evidence of landlord schemes and tricks to educate the masses, and some of the examples that they used were something as follows: an abusive landlord who beat a peasant for not carrying his sedan chair and flipped a table of food and wine at another peasant daughter's wedding. So trying to find examples of landlords who had done something that were particularly egregious and could provoke outrage from the community. And simultaneously, while they're collecting materials on landlords, they're establishing an in-group of the quote-unquote oppressed masses. They're holding these small face-to-face meetings, these mantan hui, in which they're having people almost engage in a style of group therapy, where they're sharing grievances with each other. They're speaking bitterness. And this was being used to, sharing these very emotional stories was being done to elicit group sympathy for others in the community, the so-called aggrieve, so that the suffering of one becomes the suffering of all. And in fact, one of the metrics of success for this kind of organizing, according to the party state itself, was communal crying, counting the number of people who cried in these sessions and how upset people got. And again, this is a process that I argue is ultimately about drawing these moral boundaries between an in-group and an out-group well before the violence itself is even mobilized. And in fact, this work could take weeks, if not months. This was a very, very elaborate process. So the second stage of moral mobilization and land reform is what I call moral theatrics. This is now the actual mobilization of mass violence. So again, in line with this theory, the party is actually being quite selective as it can, to target a minority of the landlord population for struggle sessions on the basis of their alleged offenses, unpopularity, etc. And so according to my my gazetteer database, I find that about 10% of the overall population that was labeled as landlords were struggled against. The focus, again, here was on the so-called evil tyrants, which was like a shorthand, not just for landlords, but other people who the party had been framing as extreme moral transgressors. There was a conscious effort to spare sympathetic figures, landlords who were popular in the community and known for their compassion. And these struggle sessions were orchestrated to maximize popular outrage. So people who participated in these struggle sessions were, in fact, coached on their delivery, almost like actors. The people who were chosen to go on stage and denounce class enemies were often the elderly and women. The party tried to find the most sympathetic figures in the community to deliver their grievances against struggle targets, and they tried to use the most lurid evidence of wrongdoing to upset the crowd. As one report, party report goes, the more vivid, concrete, and detailed, the better. And so this evidence could be everything from bloody, like torture devices, articles of clothing, or even bones. And I have here Wang Shikuo's famous charcoal sketch of a struggle session, the blood-stained shirt, because I think it actually kind of illustrates moral theatrics quite well. So in the red up top here, the red box, you see someone waving a blood-stained shirt, again, lurid evidence of wrongdoing. In the yellow box to this person's right, you have a landlord with his head bowed in shame. The land reform cadres would demand that the struggle target bow their head to the masses. And then in the blue box here, you have the accusers, who most prominently an elderly blind woman and what seems to be some injured, aggrieved family members. Beyond just making the struggle sessions kind of theatrical affairs, the party tried to also curate the audience. So they tried to pander to sympathetic audiences, or to essentially align struggle targets with audiences that would be most sympathetic to the cause that was being discussed. An example here was cadres mobilizing against a woman who was declared to be morally loose and accused of sowing discord between husbands and wives and selling women. They mobilized an all-female struggle session because they felt that they could more easily elicit outrage from the crowd and promote violence. And this moral outrage often resulted in unrestrained violence. Once the crowd was upset enough, it was pretty easy to instigate more and more violence. And what's interesting here is that the community was engaging, or at least the party was trying to get the community to engage repeatedly in violence to deepen these in-group, out-group boundaries. So there were rituals of in-group unity during and after these struggle sessions to build this in-group identity of the oppressed peasants. It was communal chanting to emphasize the triumph and the superiority of the masses and their unity with the state. Example, like long live the peasants, long live the people's militia, long live the cadres, after the violence was conducted against struggle targets. Also, kind of in line with violence spiraling out of control, the lineup of struggle targets was curated so that the targets with the most lurid and damning evidence against them were put on stage first to set off waves of violence. And more kind of political enemies, so-called counter-revolutionaries, perhaps former KMT members, were put at the end. Because the crowd at that point would be so upset and angered that they would be much more easy to, could be more easily convinced to participate in violence against people who had offenses, alleged offenses that were less seemingly egregious. An interesting example here from Huaining County in southern Anhui. The cadres reported that locals were initially apprehensive to engage in violence, but that by the third struggle session, it was discovered that many of them had snuck knives and awls in with them so that they could slash the struggle targets. Interestingly, I actually had a professor at Yale Medical reach out to me about the literature on violence and behavioral addiction, and how there's recent research showing that once you engage in violence, it actually activates addiction-like pathways, which I thought was quite interesting in the context of this repeated violence. And as violence is used repeatedly, people who commit violence are more likely to want to commit more violence. I also look at failed cases of moral mobilization, of mobilization to show why I think moral mobilization was the most important mechanism at play here. So I call these failed cases cases where the cadres failed in the quote-unquote war for sympathy against elites. Essentially, the cadres were trying to mobilize sympathy for the oppressed peasant masses, but in fact, at times they failed to do so. And in fact, the local community would sympathize with landlords instead. And so these were cases where cadres chose struggle targets who were in fact quite sympathetic. In one example here, locals actually resisted land reform violence because they felt that the landlord that they were struggling against was a good landlord because they had risen out of poverty. In another case from southern Jiangsu, women ran away in tears when they saw a female landlord being unjustly struggled against. One of them said landlord Cao was very friendly to people and barely received anything in rent. To struggle against her was really wrong. And so again, the failure to conduct moral theatrics, in fact, resulted in resistance to collective violence. And what I thought was interesting was that you also saw examples of elites trying to counter the party's mobilization with their own moral theatrics. Examples of landlords who, an example here is a landlord who started crying during a struggle session and threatened to jump into a river with their child. You had landlords who actually dressed up as if they were poorer than they actually were and pretended to be beggars to gain sympathy from the local community. So I'm going to briefly go over the cross-county analysis from the book. This speaks to the second of the major arguments in the book, that where the party-state mobilized more collective violence, it had established stronger collective identities that facilitated compliance with other state goals such as conscription, economic production, and repression. The argument here is that the violence that the party was carrying out in the early 50s wasn't just about physically eliminating the former elite. It was actually both a physical and symbolic assault on the authority of the landed elite, with the intent of creating a new national identity among the peasantry that could be used for further mobilization. And in fact, Liu Shaoqi had stated this quite directly in his own essay on land reform. I have here the land reform handbook on the right. This essay was reprinted in that handbook that was given to work teams that were sent into the countryside. So this is a text that land reform cadres were asked to read and learn from. Liu Shaoqi said that we are only abolishing their feudal system of land ownership and them as a social class. We are not eliminating their bodies. So again, the point of the violence during this period was to subdue and delegitimize the existing elite. And this kind of symbolic element of mass violence is extremely important and has been, I think, underplayed in previous scholarship. What's interesting, aside from this idea of creating a new revolutionary identity of the masses to facilitate further mobilization, you saw struggle sessions being used to promote other campaigns of state mobilization, such as agricultural production drives and military recruitment during the Korean War. And so struggle sessions were often timed before military recruitment drives or during the harvest season. So again, there were obviously in early 1950s China lots of campaigns going on at the same time as land reform. And conscription for the Korean War was one of those, as well as just in general increasing agricultural production. And what was interesting, again, was this outgroup of landlords that was created during the early 1950s was invoked in subsequent campaigns of state repression, the anti-racist campaign, as well as the Cultural Revolution. So to briefly go over the quantitative analysis, so I collected data from 250 counties in the East China Bureau to look at the relationship between violence and state mobilization. So the state mobilization outcomes I looked at were growth in agricultural production, military recruitment during the Korean War, repression during the anti-racist campaign, and then I also looked at repression during the strike hard campaign in the early reform era to see the degree to which these effects may have actually outlasted the Maoist period. As the arguments that I was testing, of course, my own argument that collective violence was the driver of state mobilization. So here I looked at struggle targets per 1,000 during the land reform campaign. The alternative arguments I looked at, mobilization capacity, you could argue that areas that had higher percentages of party members were more likely to mobilize the masses better. Another alternative explanation I looked at was social solidarity. I looked at histories of intercommunal conflict in the pre-PRC period. I also looked at nationalism, which I operationalized as whether or not a county had been occupied by the Japanese. And I also looked at other forms of state violence, such as counter-revolutionary arrests and bandit suppression. To very quickly go over the results, I found significant positive correlations between land reform violence and all of the state building outcomes that I just described. And I did not find significant correlations for these other variables. And I take this as evidence that violent moral mobilization does in fact correlate with other kinds of state mobilization, both violent and nonviolent, and that I think it's unclear how these alternative arguments, such as mobilization capacity, nationalism, etc., would be able to explain the success of state mobilization in the early and late 1950s. To kind of summarize this, essentially counties that mobilized more violence during land reform recorded greater agricultural production and military recruitment. I think there was also a very interesting relationship whereby violence begot more violence. Counties that mobilized more violence during land reform were more violent during the anti-rightist campaign, as well as the Strike Hard campaign of the early 1980s. Lastly, other forms of coercion, such as bandit suppression and arrests of counter-revolutionaries, do not significantly correlate with these mobilization outcomes. I also look at moral mobilization after Mao as well. So in the early in the early 1980s, in the early reform period, you see a lot of land reform-like techniques being revived as the party is trying to re-legitimate itself after the reform and opening. There was actually quite a wave of crime in the early 1980s as the country was exiting the Maoist period. And there were, the Strike Hard campaign used similar techniques of struggle sessions and public exhibitions of kind of lurid crimes of criminals, no longer called landlords, but criminals, to mobilize violence against a new class of moral transgressors. There were public exhibitions that were held in which kind of stories and cartoons of local crime stories were displayed to the masses. In many ways, a lot of parallels with the kind of moral mobilization that we saw in the land reform period. I also draw parallels with anti-corruption and anti-crime under Xi. So of course, in China today, we do not see the same kind of like mass participation in violence. However, we do see a similar use of moral boundary work and moral theatrics to draw these divisions between evildoers and the public. So within this broader anti-corruption campaign, spraying tigers and swatting flies, that were taking down large officials, major officials, the media was trying quite hard to mobilize outrage against officials by sensationalizing their alleged crimes. For example, gambling, prostitution, murder, etc. And so not just corruption, these officials were not just painted as corrupt, but also just very, very bad people. A lot of televised trials, sentencings, and confessions echo some of the mass mobilization techniques of the land reform period. On the right here, you have a mass rally in which the sentencing of wrongdoers is happening in public. People can show up and watch. This, I think, was being held in I think it was like a theater outside of a high school. But again, similar to Strike Hard, similar to land reform, public displays of wrongdoing and a public audience kind of observing the state punishing wrongdoers. The biggest difference here, of course, is that the masses are not encouraged to directly involve themselves in violence as they were in the Maoist period, though there are ways in which the mass support is still being elicited. I think There are instances where ordinary citizens were being rewarded for giving tips on about corrupt officials, and you could win cash prizes if you turned in corrupt officials and they were prosecuted. But certainly not the same situation as getting up on a stage, denouncing and physically attacking people. Lastly, there's the anti-crime campaign that has been ongoing for the past several years. Looks a lot like Strike Hard. This has emphasized crimes related to drugs, but again, has used a lot of the same kind of morally charged theatrical techniques of violence. Other chapters, so the book also looks at the cultural antecedents of moral mobilization going back to Imperial China. There's a quantitative analysis of the determinants of land reform violence, where I show which parts of Huaibei and Jiangnan were most likely to experience violence. And I also look at case studies of non-China cases, specifically factory mobilization under Stalin in the 1930s, as well as the Spanish Inquisition. And that's everything I have. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
In traditional theater, for instance, and then also in Maoist theater, one way to concretize how evil someone was, stories about abduction of women, right? And you haven't mentioned that specifically, but that makes it very concrete, right? Yeah. And also in both traditional and many of the other ones too, there's a linking together of landlords and officials. So they're either retired officials, they control local law and so forth. And so just to call them landlord only captures kind of a bit of the problem that they were made to represent. Yeah. So those two things.
Yeah, those are great points. So sexual crimes featured heavily in a lot of struggle sessions, for sure. That was, I think, a very common trope. Focus on what happened to women. Yes, exactly. And then, yes, the landlord label. I talk about this more in the book because I look at actual records, recordings of struggle targets in which they list out who was being struggled against. And you find the term landlord is a very nebulous kind of catch-all term. A lot of people who were labeled as landlords and struggled against were not actually wealthy. They may have been kind of middlemen. They may have actually been, as in Huaibei, particularly former bandits or bandit henchmen, or just relatively lower class people who perhaps may have been petty criminals.
So in theater, the preferred term is usually
Uba, yeah.
Evil hegemon.
Yeah.
Boss.
Exactly, yeah. Uba was a term used a lot in the land reform campaign.
Is that on? Hi, Jeff. Thank you for coming. Couple of comments and maybe questions all mixed up together. First, in your presentation, you kind of skipped over how this, I think, really persuasive sort of theoretical analysis or look-see applies to the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. You skipped over this stage and went right to Yenda. And there are many distinctions, obviously, between the Cultural Revolution and the period you're talking about. One is, of course, that the state, we're told, isn't really functioning. So if anyone's mobilizing violence, there's a question as to who it is. My own personal experience of Yenda was that there wasn't a lot of mass mobilization. There was violence, but it was absolutely meted out by the state, but in conflict with the formal legal regime, and that's why there was tension. But I'd love you to talk about the Cultural Revolution in terms of your analysis. One of the questions I have in a presentation like this is, and this varies over time, is the extent to which this mobilization, the violence that's associated, the policy goals, et cetera, are accomplished through or somehow adjacent to whatever the formal legal system is. And I love your last sentencing rally, because it's very clear it's the local court, right? Yet it's a mass sentencing rally. And, for those of us who are sort of due process freaks, we think, oh my gosh, that's not legal. But of course, it's absolutely, that twinning is absolutely important to the story you tell. And also, the charcoal drawing that you showed, to me, is an image of the traditional magistrate in a hearing, right? You have the scribe. Now you have a peasant leader who's where the magistrate is. You've got a party person next door, but you've got the demonstration of evidence on the floor. You've got the repentant defendant or a criminal, et cetera. So that, to me, at least as theater and ritual, was closely adjacent to law. The real question I have is, you have a car here that you're driving with respect to a certain period post-liberation. I'm increasingly interested in what happened in the Jiangxi and Fujian Soviets. And of course, there was their mass mobilization. There was attempts at sort of land reform. But there was also a lot of internecine competition, which got very violent inside the party. And I wonder if you would either consider taking your analytic results from this period, and applying it to the Soviets, and also trying to distinguish what happened in the Soviets in terms of lack of state power, different in-out groups. Sometimes the out groups were actually in the Communist Party, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a question at the very end there.
The Jiangxi Soviet period is quite interesting. My understanding is that land reform before 1949 was very much trial by error. And the earlier periods of violent land reform, first of all, there were experiments in peaceful land reform back then as well, that the party eventually discarded as not particularly useful for state building. But there were experiments in peaceful land reform, and there was just like kind of almost like indiscriminately violent land reform back then. And the party, I'm trying to think if the Jiangxi Soviet is the best example of that, because the Civil War era land reform was kind of used as an example of kind of aimlessly violent land reform that actually undermined a lot of popular support for the cause. This phrase like 乱打乱杀, like reckless beatings and killings, was like a term used to describe that kind of violence. And in the early 50s, the idea was, do not repeat that mistake. My understanding is that the land reform, going back to the Jiangxi Soviet period, was similarly violent without quite the same sort of discipline and kind of like theatrical orchestration. And then aside from that, let's see, the Cultural Revolution. Oh yes. So the Cultural Revolution, I originally had a quantitative chapter for the Cultural Revolution. I wasn't really satisfied with the data in the gazetteers for the Cultural Revolution. Often that data was just completely missing or not reported. And I decided to take that out of the book. I think in many ways land reform was like a dress rehearsal for the Cultural Revolution. A lot of the techniques of violence from land reform were just reprised in the Cultural Revolution. And a lot of the identities that were used for mass violence were crystallized, I think, in the land reform period. I think the violence of the Cultural Revolution, though, was not quite as top-down orchestrated as it was in land reform. And so I hesitate to call that moral mobilization, because at times it was more kind of I feel like those legalistic trappings you were just describing were perhaps more absent in that period. But yes, the kind of legalistic trappings of land reform are very, very clear. People's courts were a very popular vehicle for processing alleged crimes and meting out punishments during this time. So yeah, that's definitely a very interesting insight. And lastly, I think across time, when we look at Strike Hard and then eventually with the anti-corruption campaign, I think the masses just sort of recede farther and farther away from like the locus of violence. My understanding is that the very first Yenda campaign in the early 80s was probably more participatory than later ones. But yes, certainly much more top-down and far less mass-led than the early 1950s.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. In fact, in a couple of hours, I'm going to be teaching my students about the early 1950s, so I will benefit from your insights, and they will benefit as well. My question is, during the struggle sessions, particularly in areas that had been occupied by the Japanese, how much of the rhetoric involved, accusations of being a collaborator? It seems like that would be a very emotionally charged and fertile area to whack people with. Likewise, having been affiliated with the Kuomintang. It didn't seem to come up, but I just wonder.
Yeah, being affiliated with the Kuomintang was, I think, certainly something that came up in land reform. Japanese occupation, so that I think was a stronger framing in the North, where the Japanese occupation was more widespread and more brutal than in the territories in the South. What I've found, though, is that people who are just accused of political crimes, of being collaborators, et cetera, unless they could be tied to some sort of grievance against the community, weren't necessarily the focus point of mass violence. Because the goal was like, who can be framed in a way that would elicit mass outrage? Simply saying, oh, he was a member of the Kuomintang, we should attack him, was not a very compelling argument for the masses. Certainly, though, a lot of "quote-unquote" counter-revolutionaries who were persecuted did have affiliations with the Kuomintang, but they were not necessarily the first person put on stage in a struggle session.
Thank you for your presentation. I really love your theoretical building part because as political scientists, we tend to focus on variant states instead of Burdurian states. I love how you frame those states as a theater for people of different gangs compete for power. And I really like how you connect the land reform era to the current Xi era in China. My question is though, when we talk about when we try to borrow your analytical or theoretical framework from land reform to Xi era, the anti-corruption campaign was against mostly party officials, and the anti-corruption campaign involved a lot of police system. So my question is the land reform part is we are mobilizing people against or people outside of the region, and now we are talking about mobilize people to rise against people within the region. So when we apply the theoretical framework, how should we make adjustments of your framework to make it more suitable to the Xi eras?
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, I think the biggest difference is that it is more top-down. It's more institutionalized, judicial. But in terms of the difference of with the targets being regime insiders versus not regime insiders, I'm not sure that would change the general the mechanisms at play here, because the mechanisms I think are pretty similar regardless of who the target is. I think the bigger difference is the masses are less directly involved, and that this is a bit more top down and just overall more orchestrated.
Hi, so first, thank you for being here today. My question goes upon something you talked about on one of the last slides, which is how in modern day China, they're talking about purging their evils and citizens are doing that more through a legal sense, where the last time they were purging the four old, it was seen more through violent means. So in present day, it's more so snitching on people and then possibly getting cash consumptions for that. Do you think that if Xi Jinping promoted violence in the way that Mao did, that the citizens would turn to that in the way of purging the evils as they did in the past? Or do you think, based on the outcome and history of the Cultural Revolution, that they're more scarred by that to engage in violent means again?
Yeah, I don't think the regime would be able to mobilize that kind of mass violence. Certainly, with like the memory of the Cultural Revolution, yeah, I think that would be quite unlikely. I mean, in terms of however, kind of like, if you think of like emotional violence on social media, however, that kind of like tarring and feathering of people, that certainly is something that we see, but certainly not the kind of like mass physical violence.
Hi. I'm interested in applying your theory to an entirely different setting. One of the perplexities in American politics is the notion that the Trump voters are voting against their materialistic interests, and the moral outrage schema fits that almost perfectly, and particularly with the recent drive to demonize pedophiles, which is reasonable, and transgender, both of which are very small groups, and then to use nice-looking women to infiltrate school board settings, which gives them an organized setting across the country that's not going to be really surveilled very much. I think it's a hazard, and I think it's deliberate, and I think it has, some of the effects that you've been talking about of creating an in-group and an out-group, and making the in-group sufficiently outraged that they're beginning to be willing to commit violence.
Yeah, I think this is very applicable to the Trump campaign. I actually wanted to include this in the book, but ran out of time. It was a little too proximate when I was finishing up the work around like 2020 to put this in. But even looking before now, if we look around 2016, one of the first things Trump had done was set up a program called Voice. It was like Victims of Immigrant Crime, and I don't remember what the E stands for. The idea was for it to be like a police blotter almost, and to advertise and socialize egregious crimes by immigrants. And in fact, it was leaked that John Kelly had directed, I think ICE was perhaps in charge of this, to find the most dramatic instances of immigrant crime to put on this blotter. And certainly the right-wing media during this time was running a lot of sensationalized stories where immigrants were, instances where immigrants had murdered or assaulted people. And so I think that was very much a conscious attempt to draw like an in-group, out-group boundary in a way that no other Republican candidate had done, at least to that blatantly. So for sure. The other case related to that is actually QAnon. QAnon's quite interesting. QAnon's like the conspiracy. It's kind of a collection of conspiracy theories that led to the Pizzagate shooting. Pizzagate and the Pizzagate shooting at Comet Pizza. There was this whole discourse around the Democratic Party being filled with satanic pedophiles, and that they had children stored under this pizza shop, and some gunmen went and tried to like liberate them, and opened the door to the cellar where all the children were, and it was a broom closet. And when he was on trial, he actually said that he was just trying to save the children. And I think the use of Satanism, pedophilia, protecting children, that discourse is very interesting, that the Trump campaign and these like adjacent conspiracy movements have used these like very stark good versus evil narratives to draw group boundaries and to mobilize outrage and at times violence.
Thanks, Jeff. I have a question. It's sort of related to your answer right now, but it went back to the original, the way you set up the argument about how, this perception that class cleavages didn't work, and so morality and sort of traditional morality was more effective. And I wanted to ask whether you think that's something more distinctive in Chinese culture, because, and there's a chapter in the book about this, because it seems if you look at, say, the way in which society has mobilized during the reform period, you also see a lot of moralization instead of class appeals. So I've seen in like labor protests, in terms of, the way in which workers often kowtow, to government officials, local government officials, and the way in which they seek to involve the government. Also, like Sarah Swider's work on construction protests, where women and children are put in the front of protests. I think Kevin O'Brien and Deng Yanhua have also written about this. So it seems like something deeply important in Chinese culture as a way to emphasize hierarchy. And class is challenging hierarchy, but in this case, it's more about what you should do as an official or as a landlord. But you were just talking about the United States, and so that also made me think about the role of these moralistic appeals for populist leaders, and why that might be important. Like comparatively, when we look at populism, do you tend to see these more moralistic appeals about like divisions between us and them, or the people and the evil elite?
Yeah, the dissertation had a populist framing. At one point, I think near the end of the dissertation, I talked about populism. I actually decided not to go down that route. I removed the populism comparison because I felt like that you have the in-group, out-group division between the people and the corrupt elite. But I felt like that's kind of where the comparison ended. It's, I think, not necessarily, I may be wrong, not necessarily the same kind of deeper form of I think, the way in which corruption is framed isn't, I think, as deeply moralistic as the way I think moral mobilization has been used in like the anti-corruption campaign in China. But at least that's what I found when comparing to like European populism. I feel like Xi's anti-corruption campaign feels a little different from like European populist campaigns. And you had mentioned, relationships to Chinese culture. So I talk about norms of propriety and benevolence in the book. I didn't talk about them in this presentation, but I think there were these norms around how landlords should be and how they should act. That there was a certain acceptance of the traditional class hierarchy, but there was like a moral economy, essentially, that landlords were meant to be, to some degree, benevolent towards their tenants, and not do harm against them, which I don't know to what degree that's different from the kind of moral economy that like E.P. Thompson talks about. So I don't know if I would have to think a little bit harder about whether or not this is something kind of unique to Chinese moral economy. But certainly class in China, and plenty of scholars have written about this, historically has had a kind of moral kind of valence.
I have a question from the virtual audience.
Mm-hmm.
From your research perspective, what are your thoughts on current events in China regarding successful CEO entrepreneurs disappearing? Jack Ma a few years ago, and recently, early November, Douyu CEO Chen Xiaojie.
The crackdown on like the business elite, I'm not sure it's quite the same as the kind of anti-corruption mobilization that I've been talking about. It's something I have to look into a bit more. Like, I've not actually followed a lot of the official media coverage on it. It didn't seem to me like it involved the same level of like moral theatrics, boundary work, etc., as a lot of the anti-corruption mobilization in the past. But it's something I can look into. But off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
I just retired, so I'm not going to do it anymore, but for a long time I taught a crime and detection in Chinese literature course and used a couple of terms such as private versus state violence, sanctioned versus unsanctioned violence, right? And so in the traditional system, private violence was called in because of gaps in the system. This felt that was not really just. The PRCs can say, we can be just, right? And then with the sanctioned and unsanctioned business, I would assume that you would want to put that into your title, right? We're really talking about, from the PRC's point of view, this is sanctioned violence in most cases, right? And then representations. I can't think of a single mass media representation of violence that allows people to take justice in their hands. So, for instance, if you talk about Bai Mao Nu, white-haired girl, this guy's going to be taken away and dealt with. Same with Hai Rui Ba Guan. The situation is just kind of left there, right? And so it's not actually represented, which would be quite difficult, right, and dangerous. So those kind of things, those terms are what I would use with the kids in class.
Yeah, I mean, the party was very concerned about losing control over the violence it was mobilizing. The party wanted to be leading the masses in violence, even during the land reform period.
People say that's what happened with the Cultural Revolution and had to pull back.
Yeah.
How does this experience in China relate to the Zimbardo experiment? You take a set of people, normal people, and you divide them by giving one moral authority over the other, and the result is devastating.
Yeah, the Zimbardo experiment, I mean, there was a lot of controversy over the Zimbardo experiment and what actually happened and what direction was given to the participants. Like, that story's evolved a lot over time. I think one difference is, and same with the Milgram experiment, there's also been a lot of debate over what exactly was, how participants were nudged or prompted to engage in to use shock. Shock treatments against other participants. I feel like there is in Zimbardo and in Milgram, it's all just about authority. It's just about the structure. You're in an environment where there's an imposing authority, and you feel some sense of need to comply because there's an authority figure watching you, and so you're more likely to engage in violence. I feel like what we find here is that obviously a coercive authority needed to be there, kind of orchestrating the violence during land reform. But this moral framing was still very important. And that, to me, kind of militates against this idea that it's just about the power structure itself, that there was some concern around whether or not there was any sort of like legitimacy to the violence being used.
Thank you for the great talk. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.